Research shows that 70% of leadership training is forgotten within 24 hours. But there's one intervention that creates what our guest today calls a leadership interrupt. And it's the difference between incremental change and true transformation. I'm 𝗘𝗽𝗄𝗯, President and COO of Spark Effect and the host of Courage to Advance podcast. And on this episode, I'm joined again by Rod Bacon, our Chief Coaching Officer at Spark Effect. Many of you may have listened to our last episode on why AI can't call us out on our BS. If you missed it, please check it out. But today, we're diving into the biggest misconceptions about executive coaching, from why it's seen as leadership rehab instead of growth amplifier, and looking at how 360 based feedback creates this kind of transformative interrupts that separate incremental change from real leadership evolution. Rod, welcome back to Courage to Advance podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, after our last conversation, we had a lot of people just weighing in on the topic and giving feedback and asking questions. And so, having come off of the discussion around this AI and the future of executive coaching, we thought maybe we should continue the conversation and address some of those issues or topics that were raised when we were talking about this afterwards. So that's what we're going to do today. And so, really to begin with, I think you and I both know executive coaching has so many applications and is so powerful. And yet there's still some misperception about it out there that we want to address. So let's take the first one. When we think about executive coaching and how sometimes people see it as maybe not so as much of this superpower strength, and sometimes we hear it more for, oh, that must be when people feel like they really need to fix something. And so I think that's maybe a good place for us to start and talk about in more depth.
Okay. Yeah, well, I see that, but luckily I'm seeing it less these days. But in some organizations still, it's like a scarlet letter to have a coach. I know I felt that way when I first had a coach back in 1997, and I was CEO of a technology company. I was like, what is this? And I felt like it was, it was a negative thing, but it was a really powerful experience for me. And so for those attitudes that see it as like leadership rehab or something like that, my view would say, I'd say we're going to see it as a growth amplifier, of taking the opportunities through reflection, through creating that we talked about in the last session, that element of safety, to create a space which we don't often get in our life. This is what's such a value in organizations, I say, is that when people get coaching, they're able to look at their strengths, what potentially are getting in the way of kind of accelerating those, and really grow. So it's a growth amplifier, not just leadership rehab, but at the points where it is rehab and that's necessary, that can be okay too.
It makes me think about the first executive coach I had. And it was one of those situations where I knew something was broke in my leadership. I was a young leader, didn't go through a leadership, training boot camp sort of scenario, and really realized that there was something about my approach that was having my team just not it just was not working, right? I affectionately said it was a bit of mutiny that was starting to happen here. And so one of the things that I did is I proactively sought out support, because inside my organization it wasn't available. And when I asked my direct manager about, hey, there's something off, I'm trying to figure out what it was, he was not helpful at all. And so when I went to and found my first executive coach, part of it was I said, look, I know something's broken and I need to figure that out, because I really want to lead, and I want to lead and be a leader that people want to follow. And so that put me on my journey of recognizing for myself that there were some gaps, and it was a tough journey. And it was a really, it was a tremendous growth opportunity as well. And, the coming out the other end of that, I had gained the followership of my team, but the process is sometimes it's not so cut and dry. And I think that's sometimes maybe where people get just some misconceptions about it, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a beautiful example that you had the wherewithal to look, forward and say, I could use some coaching. I don't even know what I don't know, but how can I get better? I think that's a great example because one of the things that I hear a lot is some people will say like, I talk to individual coaches and they'll say like, I don't want like to do 911 coaching or something like that.
Hmm.
And to be honest, I don't have a problem. And many of our coaches actually they embrace, they say, give me your toughest individuals because it's when we bump up against something, when we stumble, that that we become aware, just like you described or I described, that I could be doing better. And coaching helps us get over that, gives us the support to hopefully excel. So bring us your damage, bring us your 911, bring us your growth, people who want growth accelerators. It's all a starting point for coaching.
Absolutely. So, when we think about, organizations and how they, the varying ways that they view coaching,
Mhm.
what shifts in organizational culture when when leadership really starts viewing coaching as this more strategic tool, like we hope they do?
What shifts in the
Yeah.
organization?
So what shifts do we see in this in organization's culture when coaching is embraced in this way that we're talking about?
Well, I see a number of factors. One of the most powerful things I see is modeling to the other rank and file,
Mhm.
that the company is committed to the growth. The kind of coaching that we do, the most impactful coaching, kind of stakeholder model coaching, the tough part about that is that it requires the leader to be transparent and
Mhm.
vulnerable and say, I'm not perfect and I'm leaning into the growth, but there are so many positive outcomes of that. And one of them is this whole piece of modeling again, that leaning forward, leaning into growth. Because like I just said a minute ago, that it's that accelerator, that
Mhm.
amplifier. And when you want to create a culture where everybody is being modeled like we're not perfect, so become comfortable with your edges, and you just described it great yourself, where I can maybe get better and then lean into the growth. So that's one of the pieces I think is just kind of modeling and setting up an organization for that continual, the Jim Collins and Peter Senge's, that continual learning edge. There's no better way than individuals, not posters on the wall, but individuals say, hey, I'm working on getting better. Would you be willing to help me?
And I think just to go off that even further, we have often talked about that in a sense like a multiplier effect, right? Like the more that you can invest in the leadership and your leaders can grow and then they can model and then you can start to see in a sense more of that starting to spread. That's a powerful place to be. And it's a really important element of trust building inside an organization and with individual leaders, as well. And I think that seems commonplace, and yet in the experiences we have as coaches and and as working with organizations as we do, it's not as obvious as we would think it would be,
Well,
or as commonplace maybe.
I hope that changes. And like when you're talking, I remember once I was doing working with this, individual responsible for $2.5 billion worth of sales, and was coaching him. And then so he invited me as a coach to like their, global kickoff, here in San Jose. And he was on stage talking, and he pointed me out and he said, "That guy right over there, raise your hand." He goes, "He's my executive coach." And he made a joke about it. He goes,
Yeah.
"Any problem with my personality, go talk to him." But the fact that he leaned into that, then I had two people reporting up to him later saying, like, I want to know about this, etc., because they'd seen transformation. He was willing to say, I'm resourcing myself. How important is that as a leader to say, I am resourcing myself, whether it's money or through support, to get better for myself and the organization? So that's the message that I want, people to hear and say. I mean, whether it's race, I don't know if you're sports, whether it's LeBron James, whether it's race car drivers, everybody at the top of their game has a coach
Yes.
to help them see things that they're not seeing, or just to be that reflective nature, saying, "Oh, my backswing is off," and da da da, and what's going on. If they are investing, if people at the top of their game are investing in mastery, why wouldn't we?
Absolutely. That elevating to the next level, challenging yourself, dialing it up just a little bit further. And I think, one of the really important factors that we've also heard people speak to is this idea of of gathering feedback from others, right? So we talk about it from, we call it often stakeholder insights or something along those lines. And so I think one of the things I think it'd be important for us to kind of talk about is, that concept gets thrown around, and yet there's tremendous power in having that kind of vulnerability brought in with the insights of others. And so I think, talk a little bit about how you work, kind of through that with executives that maybe are a little hesitant to bring in that level of
Yeah.
insight.
Well, it often is. So first of all, I know that there's a world out there, and I've done a lot of the 360, feedback systems, and we even have those for some of our programs. But when companies invest in stakeholder feedback for their leaders, it is a game changer.
Mhm.
Absolutely. On multiple levels. The first is oftentimes the leaders themselves are a little hesitant because we're going in and we're asking open-ended questions. And I was sharing with someone the other day, when I'm talking to someone, getting 360 feedback, oftentimes they say to me, well, in the shower this morning, here's what I wanted to say to you. So I can just start by saying, what do you need? What is it you want to tell me about this leader, right? And everybody knows that. So as opposed to a 360 where you have a bubble chart, like, this competency, how are they doing? Whoo, it's open field. But that's what you need and want as a leader. If we see that, if we say that, feedback is the breakfast of champions, well, interview-based feedback is the best of those breakfasts, it's the most protein. But it requires vulnerability
Mhm.
because, you don't know what someone's going to say. The other piece about it is when we're doing these interview-based 360s, let's say someone's talking about, and in the interview, they're talking about how the leader is showing up in the meeting. And maybe they've cut off somebody, they didn't let people share their other points of view. Rather than just getting that data, what we ask is, okay, well, what was the impact of that for the meeting? And maybe someone's saying, well, the person walked away kind of demoralized. What was the impact of that? And then it
Mhm.
talks about that maybe that they're doing less work or they're looking for another job. And so we get the impact and we share that with the leader, but the inverse is also true. We say something like, okay, given that situation, how could have that leader done it differently? Like actually, behaviorally, what could they done differently? And what would have been the impact of that? So we gather it's like X-ray vision into a leader and how they're behaving in their environment. And it doesn't matter when it's not inside their environment. Everything we do in that case is helping the leader understand the impact that they're having in their organization for the particular humans, which are different. Something will land differently for me than it will for you.
Mhm.
So getting that detailed information is just incredibly valuable. So it generates vulnerability. It creates deeper level of insights. It creates a systemic change in the organization. I can go on and on about the power of 360, of interview-based 360s, but I'll pause and see if you have a question because I love it. It's really powerful.
I think that's no, I think what you're saying is really important. And I think we have, like, as you start off by saying, we have this point of view of that both that feedback is really good, that there are two primary ways of gathering it. You primarily described that stakeholder or live 360. And the other side is when we have really specific instruments that are used for online measurement and they're measured against competencies and different behaviors. And I think both have a really strong place depending on kind of the leader and the situation. What I really like about what you were saying that I think does bring some distinction between the two, again, where they both have a really strong place, is there's nuance that can happen when you're having those live discussions, where, as you said, the way somebody showed up in a room, or you get more of these. For example, this
Yeah.
is how I'm trying to describe what I've experienced, and that is a different that is a different
Qualitatively different
quality.
kind of
Yeah, very much
information.
so. Yeah, and
And
and I think whereas the online version, we're bringing in aspects of that, but not the degree of the follow-up nuance, and the quantitative side is more strongly represented, perhaps, but not exclusive of just that.
the other piece that comes up for me that I say to people sometimes is that, leaders men and women, if you're leading in an organization, you're oftentimes kind of a type A personality. You're a driver. You get things done. You take responsibility, and and you know, change incremental change can be easy. Bigger change, transformative change, change that really makes a difference sometimes requires, like in adult learning theory, they call it like an interrupt. You have to
Hmm.
have an interrupt to be able to take new information and process it and result in a different change, as opposed to something incremental. And so like oftentimes these interview-based 360s, I mean, they're relatively more expensive and they're worth every penny because the reports that come out of them are so detailed. They're often 10, 15 pages, of people reading the verbatim statements that the coach is then organizing into themes. I've worked with very senior individuals who have said, I have never had anything like this in my career.
Hmm.
Sometimes they'll say, I keep it on my bedside table and I refer back to it. I share it with my wife. It becomes an interrupt because then a good coach helps them digest that and see what the path of change, what can be positive based on that information. So the power, like you said, the qualitative information, the information is qualitatively different.
Hmm.
The power of that for creating the space, the openness for true transformation is unique. The 360s are great for measuring those incremental changes. You're rarely going to get because one last thing, two examples come to mind. One that was harsh, kind of like where the feedback you're getting is someone saying something like, wow, I don't know how this person is even still in this job. And that's important information.
Yeah.
But the other side, an executive is working with recently, is hearing feedback from very senior people saying, we want more of her. She can be,
Mhm.
we love what she's doing. And she was not fully aware of that. So it's just like a completely different kind of thing that is really valuable in so many ways.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this. When you have executives resistant to this idea, how do you help them kind of understand, the benefits of what we're talking about here?
Great. I start off with, and sometimes I raise my hand if I'm in a human process dynamic or group, and I agree with something or I share the same dynamic, I raise my hand. So when I'm sitting with an executive, I say, listen, I believe each and every one of us is a work in progress, and my hand goes up as well. And I talk about that. I think it was like Gandhi or someone said that there is no true strength without vulnerability.
Mhm.
And so because you have to be able to guide these executives oftentimes to be willing to do this kind of interview-based 360. But I've always been able to, and I work with them and honor and respect sometimes they have, well, let's not do this group or let's not do that group, or let me make sure I understand the questions you're going to ask. But it's by creating that safe container, having them know 100% I'm in their corner,
Mhm.
and then helping them see the benefits of when other people see that. I mean, Brene Brown talks about it, everybody talks about it. It's easy, Patrick Lencioni talks about it. It's easy to talk about vulnerability. It's sometimes the hardest thing to do, but the power of it calibrated correctly. I never push for vulnerability if I think the executive is living in a shark tank. That would
Right.
be malpractice. But the proper level of transparency and vulnerability is real game changer. And so once we have that conversation and simultaneously saying, hey, all of us are, at a growth edge at some point in our life, we usually can get them to embrace that process. So that's some of the conversation that we have to move them from some resistance to acceptance.
So then when you get this type of feedback, how do you get leaders not just to hear it, but actually then to integrate it into their action plan, into seeing the upside of moving forward, into knowing that sometimes there may be, if some of that feedback isn't as
Yeah, harsh.
ideal,
Yeah.
right? And you
Yeah.
want it, then you have to show back up in that room and try. So how do you help people kind of then bridge that?
That's beautiful, and I'm sorry, I know this is this conversation and not the last conversation, but this is for me, this is like the core of the human element
Mhm.
versus even the best of the AIs, which I love AI, I'm all over it. But to help somebody digest that information, um, it's like you first have to see them and they have to see you. You create that psychological safety. Um, you help them through it. I mean, I've had a number of executives that say when they were first receiving that information, it felt like almost too much. And or they, like all of us, you'll have a gauge where you stop reading it or you stop digesting it. So then as a good executive coach, we're doing this work because we essentially love humans and want to see and help them grow. And so in creating that sense of safety, having them kind of go back and look at it, and none of us push past people's limits, right? So I've had executives read and only take out certain amount of information that they could digest and leave the other on the table. You know what? That can be fine because we're just looking for the way we do it. We look for what is one of the biggest one or two changes that would move the needle for you as a leader and your organization. And then we just focus on that. There may be a lot of other information in these reports that is valuable, but is not necessarily going to be digested at that time. So it's about calibrating, it's about love, and making people safe, making them feel safe, and that we're all in this together.
I think that's really powerful. And I don't think that it's often framed that way. Or, when people are from the outside looking in, thinking about this or being asked to engage in coaching, I think sometimes it's not the way you've described it isn't, it's not always presented that way. And I think that's a really important mindset shift for people to have and think about. We often are also face this idea of people thinking, well, I don't need coaching. What I actually need is just, help me just get better at, my executive presence, or help me get better at just like, presenting to my board. And we find that that's actually perfect examples
Yeah.
of coaching opportunities. And, one you and I have talked about before is this idea of, executive presence, right? We hear that come up a lot and people think about, help me to be a better presenter, or things like that, right? And what we really know, it's not about how you're necessarily the idea of your wardrobe, or how you hold your hands. But I think that's one that it would be. Let's dive into that one a little bit more, because that's one that comes up a lot.
Yeah, and that's I like that one because in my prior career, I was a college teacher in presentations and communications, organizational communications, etc. And I worked overseas in working with executives about how to do presentations, organize their slides. And it's funny because in that iteration of my own life, the executive presence was often about like tone of voice, you're too monotonous, keep your hands by your side, use gestures or whatever those pieces were. And so there's a place for that,
Yeah.
there's a place for dress and gesture. But in working with leadership, executive presence is more about embodying the confidence and the openness, uncertainty, transparency, all of that, embodying leadership in a way that is kind of grounded. We were on a call earlier today with one of our senior coaches who had a long 20-year career in HR. And he says he primarily works with leaders, he says, from the neck down.
Yes.
And it's because executive presence is about that. And what's interesting is that sometimes these behavioral characteristics can help somebody like, that fake it as you until you make it kind of
Hmm.
thing. Because if they are in leadership groups or talking to teams, slowing down, um, making space for other comments, are important pieces. But at the end of the day, it's about it's about the leader knowing that they have a seat at the table. I worked with a woman executive a couple years ago, responsible for so much at a very large Fortune 25 company. And that was the work for her. Her work was essentially, I used the analogy of, who is it? I forget the guy who in the fables takes the sword out of the stone.
Oh, yes.
But you can't, like,
Yes.
everybody comes to try to take the sword out of the stone, right? And it was for her, and that metaphor came up in our conversation about what does she have to shift internally for her, where she could take that sword and claim that seat, because that's what the organization wanted for her. So for executive presence for her was an internal job until she could kind of own that. And so that's the work that we did together. And she got there, and it was beautiful.
And I think that's a great example of how, sometimes the context we hold around how we think a term, it means, represents for us, is really not anything like the experience of it. And that's a really great example of thinking about what it means to have show up with the executive presence in a way that is so powerful, and where this executive coaching can take us. You know, when I think about some of the examples that I've had too, I think about some of this communication and styles with leaders. And, leaders, I worked with a leader at one point that said, I just need to be more, the feedback was around communication, and interpreted as, well, I write all the emails, I try to make sure everything's really clear. And what was missing in that was really this understanding that in the sense of communication with the team, it was more around working through, are you all on the same page? Have you all agreed to the different things that are the most important? Do you have the really clear points that you're trying to communicate so that it's
Hmm.
showing alignment and unity, and
Yeah.
in that way, transparency? And that was something that there was this sense of, it was just a tactical thing, to
Hmm.
more of a, no, it's a more of a bigger philosophical understanding with you and your team, and how you go about being united as a team. And that was just one little aspect of that kind of lens that has come up for me as you were saying, speaking of that executive presence example as well.
Yeah, I think that one's great because it both can be true. Like there's an element, and I run into this quite often as well, where you're helping a leader get clarity on that communication or getting those feedback loops. Because if the leader can become aware that the message, the culture they're trying to build or the strategic initiative is not being embraced by their stakeholders, again, how valuable is that information? Because we've all had enough of where in the meetings people nod their heads, and so you think you have a commitment or alignment,
Hmm.
only to find out you wait, that sounded like it came from a place of direct experience.
Of course.
Where we think, and the people in the room lead us to believe that we have alignment. So getting that information by itself, the fact that there's a gap, is tremendously valuable. Understanding to the leader the two sides of that, like, are the reinforcing behaviors in place? Because those are behaviors that need to happen. Are you, seeking confirmation, that feedback? And then there's the presence side. I'm working with a leader right now in the medical space, and this is part of his issue. He's trying to drive a culture change. And so on his behalf, on these interview-based 360s, again, doesn't happen in a computer one, we're asking that question. How well did the people around him understand his initiatives and the drive? And it was not 100%. And so we looked at some of these, both behavior and also his own presence about, was he modeling the fact of
Mm.
this was a critical thing for the organization? There was a level of urgency and neededness to see this change, or was he putting out the message, let's all do this, but then kind of falling back on like, I've said it. It's like the person in the relationship and says, sweetheart, you don't tell me you love me. Hey, I told you I love you the day we got married. Do you want to hear it again? I mean, you need to hear, I need to hear that all the time.
The reinforcement of action, and but to
Reinforcement.
support the behavior.
Right.
So, as we kind of start to wrap up some of this conversation, one other topic I think is really important that we do continue to hear people asking for some of the clarifying communication or differentiators of is when we think about what's the difference between executive coaching and training, or maybe the better question is where are they from an application standpoint? When is it that training is perhaps what's needed versus no, is this really an executive coaching opportunity? And we tend to see sometimes there's a sense that everything can be fixed with training. And I think it's important that we really dig into that, because that's not how it really plays out, especially when we've come in to do executive coaching and maybe people have had training in certain areas. So I
Right.
think, really talking about, what can training accomplish that coaching can't, and vice versa, where do they fit?
Yeah. Well, they both are critically important, as we know, for all of us training. So training is essentially the skills and the gap analysis. Do I have the information I need? Um, Coaching maybe is more about, am I putting it into practices? And if I'm not, can I be reflective or through help understand why I'm not?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm looking at if I have the resources, if I have the skills and the knowledge and I'm not putting it into practice, that's a coaching opportunity, right? If we go into a situation, if we go into an organization and find out that someone does have a skill gap in so many areas, it's sometimes in coaching, we can provide that, as coaches and as Spark Effect, we have a lot of resources we bring to the table. So closing a skills gap is one piece, and training is all about that. But training alone leaves people without the embodied, the being able to follow it through necessarily. We know from just training, there's what's the study called the forgetting curve. I don't know if you know the stats on that, but it's a widely cited research paper that shows that up to 70% of training information is forgotten within 24 hours. Up to 90% of it is forgotten within a week if it's not reinforced. And the key thing there is if it's not reinforced. So when you map coaching, because coaching is essentially a one-on-one experience and it's designed for reflectivity and increasing awareness of what I'm doing. When you combine that with training content, you incredibly greatly enhance the memorability of whatever the training content is and the application of it. So you go through some sort of training, you get coaching following that training, saying, how are you putting into this practice? And very importantly, what are the barriers or where are you not? Because again, sometimes people will have information but not put it into practice. And if you dig deeper, it's because of an identity piece or I'm not comfortable with, or I have a fear. So I don't know if I answered your question, but training is hugely valuable. Coaching on top of training extends and gets a lot more ROI from whatever
Mm-hmm.
the training you've done. Even when it's these team building trainings, I worked a lot with the Lencioni group, the five dysfunctions of a team, and they started to bring in coaching after some of their work to really reinforce the behaviors, keep them active, not just I've learned them. So that's one element. And then real quickly, the other, I just want people to remember that coaching essentially is a one-on-one reflective practice that builds its richness through the safety in the relationship with the other coach. And that's where you're looking at, hey, this is the pattern that keeps coming up, or it's identity-based work a lot of the times.
Mm-hmm. So much accountability is built into that dynamic too, more so than what training alone can provide, which is really, I mean, the stats you just quoted were, that's incredible. It makes sense in many ways when we think about just some of our own experiences of things throughout the years of like, this was a really good thing I learned, and yet I don't necessarily always bring it into the flow of work until I have some other types of, reinforcement and accountability to do so. So I think that's just really, it's it should have us all pause and think about when we have the investments we have to make in training, how do we ensure those investments are going to pay off? And really thinking about it in the way that we're talking about
I
here
wanted
is a good
to,
one.
yes, that's 100% correct. And then to what you said earlier about like when you as a leader were realizing that you had more opportunity, that's the part where, again, coaching is so valuable because a leader oftentimes doesn't have time for a lot of this training content, right? They've got that
Mhm.
earlier in their career. So yes, absolutely, coaching accentuates the value of the training, and then bringing an executive coach, as we've talked about with that 360 or the interview-based 360 to any leader. Again, I ask myself, everybody in this audience, who amongst us is not a work in progress? And so if we
Yes.
know that we have growth edges and we lean into those, this is where, again, coaching is that growth amplifier.
Absolutely. So if we think about, as we start to wrap up again here, what if, we think about this AI conversation, we think about executive coaching we had in before. So where do you see the biggest opportunity for organizations to really expand their thinking about executive coaching in the age of AI and all the other demands that are being faced?
Um, that's a great question, and it's one that we don't have time to attend a lot of time on, but it's a really great question. I was working with a leader just last week, and now that AI is amongst us all, she was having some great challenges around communicating with a very acerbic individual. At least that was her side of the story. And so we started talking about how she might use ChatGTP or other tools to run through how she might respond and get suggestions and ideas. I thought that's beautiful. And I think that AI is going to be helpful in that way for a lot of people.
Mhm.
For a lot of us, myself and people will be using it to help craft emails. So where does coaching? Coaching is not going to go away because again, coaching is this more reflective piece around looking at the patterns and our identity and what needs to change and how do we get the support to change to really transform, as opposed to AI is going to be a great tool for helping that incremental change. How might I say something better? And you can learn from that, but it's not going to give you that kind of that leadership interrupt and
Mhm.
the see the opportunity and then the one-on-one support to help kind of and grow into that opportunity.
So I think that's a really nice way to think about it, especially with AI around us every single day. So here's the final question.
Okay.
If you had to leave our listeners with just one question to ask themselves about, how they're currently thinking about executive coaching in their organizations in this face of AI, in this new world, what would it be?
What I love about all organizations is that when are people coming together to kind of achieve results and goals. And when I work with organizations and you really ask about their goals, they have their goals, and I say, well, what are your aspirations? And the aspirations are even above the goals, what we really want to be in the world. So the question I would leave this group with for yourself or your organization, just ask yourself, what could really change? What change would need to happen within your organization to have your organization really reach its goals and its aspirations? And you might find some knowledge or training that we need, better market knowledge, better this, better pricing information. But I would also challenge you to take a look at, see, it's likely it's that transformative growth. It's that growth in the individuals that help them in this process of becoming a learning machine to learn quickly from the feedback level. So if we create kind of learning individuals through coaching that can kind of model that learning within the organization, I would say, take a look at that. Is it knowledge or is it really kind of like transformed individuals, leaders, that is what you need to reach your own goals?
I think that's a great question to end on. Rod, thank you so much for coming back and continuing this conversation. And I think it's been very valuable for everybody.
I've enjoyed it. I love this conversation, as you can tell, and I like having the conversation with you, Kim. So thank you for inviting me in.
Thank you. For our listeners, we have free resources relevant to our conversation today that you can download by visiting courage2advancepodcast.com, which will take you to our Spark Effect podcast page. And if you're interested in exploring how human-centered coaching can transform your leadership team, visit sparkeffect.com to learn more about our executive coaching and organizational development solutions. I want to thank Rod again for this very insightful conversation. And thank you to the Empathy Edge for hosting our podcast subseries, and to our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Courage to Advance, where transformative leadership isn't about having all the answers, it's about having the courage to find them. Thank you.